All right, so we're going on to lecture 2 for the Land Resources chapter 18. And shame on me, I didn't put the reading pages that accompanies this. Pretty self-explanatory though, so make sure you guys are keeping up with that reading. So we spent a little time in class talking about forests and sustainable forestry practices. How can we use trees, wood, lumber as a resource, but still help to maintain functional habitat and biodiversity. All right. So first of all, why are forests important to us aside from the fact that we can harvest the lumber? All right. They help to maintain clean air and water. They help to maintain soil quality. They help provide habitat, not just for humans, but for other organisms. They help with climate moderation. They are an extremely important carbon sink. Okay? In other words, they take carbon out of the air. Okay, and they play an important role in the hydrologic cycle, which is also part of the climate, right? So if you take a look in this diagram, when the rain falls on a forest, right, we get about 25% or more seeps into the ground. 75% of that is transpired back to the atmosphere, which helps maintain certain humidity levels, decreases the amount of water lost to evaporation from soil because of the humidity, etc. Okay, so forests are an important habitat, and if we are going to use forests and forest products as a resource, obviously to avoid the tragedy of the commons scenario, we need to manage them. So traditional forest management looks like this. Looking at this, what do you see? You see lots of trees, right? That's good. Okay, now notice they're all relatively the same size. They're planted in rows. And what do you see on the ground? Not a darn thing other than pine needles. Okay? Now, that is not even close to an actual forest ecosystem. That's just rows of trees. All right? So traditional forest management would be we go clear cut and we replant a bunch of trees, all relatively the same age, nice systematic manner, right? We let them grow for a while, then we go cut them down again. All right? So that maintains a low diversity, what they call monoculture, which is essentially just planting the same tree. Okay? Now, what we'd call a more sustainable forest, we've got some balance between how old the trees are, for example, the type of trees. So we're diversifying not just the age of the trees, but the species of trees. Again, most forest ecosystems, particularly your old growth, have a diversity of plant life, okay? And in doing so, we found that we're able to help prevent soil erosion, preserve watersheds, and maintain what are called wildlife corridors between log areas, okay? So this is a nice little diagram illustrating what you guys read about the other day, right? So the different ways of going into a particular forest ecosystem and harvesting trees, right? The most restrictive and they're also the most sustainable method is what they call selective cutting. Okay? So you're only picking the older mature trees. Okay? In shelterwood cutting, you're essentially selecting more trees than you would with selective cutting. It's kind of the same principle though. Seed tree cutting is close to a clear cut, but you are leaving some trees behind so that the forest can regenerate naturally. That helps maintain biodiversity in terms of genetics at least. And then of course we have our clear cutting method, which is the most profitable but also the most destructive. All right? So I'm not sure if you guys drive down parts of the West Coast ever, but occasionally you can look up and see these big scarred hillsides like this, right? So you got your dirt roads for the trucks and so on to drive on. All the trees removed from these clear cuts. And here you can see an area that was clear cut a year or two before, but replanted. And you got lots of those young trees, right? So that's what that looks like. And so the issue, again, with relying on forests is, we rely on timber, and timber is an important resource, and it's a renewable resource. So it's not that we shouldn't be accessing forest products, but we also need to recognize that forests are a vital habitat and they provide so many important ecosystem services that we can't just continue to deforest areas hoping we can just replant them. We talked about the issues of complexity in our forests earlier in class. Okay, so we need to try to develop methods and utilize those methods even though they might be less profitable that allow for a sustainable forest management so that we can maintain those ecosystem services, maintain biodiversity, but also get the products we need. Okay, so deforestation. The textbook definition of deforestation is a temporary or permanent clearance of large expanses of forest. The most common reason we are clearing forests, though, is actually for agriculture, not just for forest products. Now, between 2000 and 2005, world forests shrank by over 90 million acres. And some of the human causes for deforestation, fire. All right, so land clearing and drought has caused worse fires than maybe occur naturally. Again, agriculture is the biggest one. Road construction, tree harvest, so logging, and then insect and disease. Now, you'd think of insects and disease as a natural phenomenon, but some of them are invasive, so they're brought in either maybe inadvertently, but brought in by humans, right? Some of them are becoming more prominent because it's not getting as cold in the wintertime, right? So the pine beetle, for example, the pine beetle problem we're having right here in our backyard is partially at least blamed on the fact that our winters have been warmer. And so they are able to thrive better, and therefore they're killing off a lot of our ponderosa pine trees here in the Northwest. All right. So the negative sides of deforestation, decreased soil fertility, increased soil erosion, increased silt buildup behind dams, more sedimentation of our waterways, desertification in our tropical dry forests. We'll talk about those in a little bit. And of course, extinction of species. And because they are an important climate moderator, we deforest areas, we're going to see some climate changes as a result. It's not all fossil fuels, folks. All right. Now, in the U.S., interestingly, because of environmental legislation, and in the 1970s and the Endangered Species Act, etc., most of the forests in the U.S. are either steady or actually expanding. Now, they are not back to their original state. That takes hundreds and hundreds of years. But we are not having a net deforestation in the U.S., at least at present. Okay? Now, they're in that secondary succession pattern and to various degrees along the way. But that's an interesting fact, right? 57% of the forests in the U.S. are privately owned. Federal government owns 20%, corporations 15%, and state and local governments 8%. So a little over half don't have the government agencies managing them. Okay. Let me see. Now, is that the fact that our forests are steady or actually even growing in some cases, is that because we are using less timber? Or is it because we're just getting it from somewhere else? The fact of the matter is we're actually using as much or more timber, but we're just getting it from other areas, and primarily the boreal forest. Okay, and we'll talk about the boreal forest as well in just a minute. Now, one of the things we are doing in the U.S. and other countries have similar legislation is what's called the Forest Legacy Program and conservation easements. And essentially what we do with those programs is these privately owned forests, right? So there's an economic incentive to allowing developers to purchase that land, develop that land, or come in and log it, and so on. And so, much like the conservation reserve, the CRP land for agriculture, we're actually paying farmers not to farm, to return it back to native vegetation to avoid soil erosion. The Forest Legacy Program and conservation easement allows these private individuals to sell not the land itself, but development rights to the land to prevent development. So it's a permanent, legally binding agreement where the owner of the forest, private owner of the forest, sells development rights, but doesn't necessarily sell the land. So they still get to maintain ownership. They can access that or put up no trespassing signs however they want, but they are not legally allowed to then develop that land. Even if they want to, they'd have to essentially buy those conservation easements back if they're even allowed to do that. Okay? So U.S. national forests, this would be federally owned land, right? Now, the national forests are not like our national parks or wild wilderness areas or wildlife refuges. They are not simply set aside for conservation. They are actually set aside for us to use, okay? But they are managed. There's restrictions on how we can log and how much we can log. You have to apply for permits. You pay for them, right? And so they have scientists, wildlife biologists, all kinds of people employed with the U.S. Forest Service, for example, to help manage the land and prevent what they call tree poaching and stuff like that. But we can go into our national forests and log them, right? We can bring livestock into our federal lands and let them graze, right? We can mine, we can hunt, we can fish in our national forests, okay? But they are managed to help avoid that tragic commons issue, all right? Road building for logging companies does create some issues. Clear cutting is still allowed in our national forests, all right? Now, going globally, right? So again, the U.S. forests specifically, steady or expanding because we've implemented some important management strategies. If we go globally, we are seeing a net decrease in our forests, and some of our most important habitat, our best carbon sinks, our most diverse, most biodiverse areas are our tropical forests, tropical rainforests especially, okay? And so these would be these green areas you see here, and Central and South America, Africa, and Indonesia. All right. So what we're seeing is not just some minor decline. We are seeing extremely rapid decline in our tropical rainforests, and we'll talk some about the biodiversity loss in a later chapter. But this is hugely concerning. Okay. Mostly due the number one cause, like I said earlier, is actually agriculture, and it's what we call subsistence agriculture, which is a little different maybe than, sorry about that, a little different from agriculture we do in the U.S. Subsistence agriculture is people farming and raising livestock for their own food, their own existence. They're not selling it by the bushel and making a profit from it. They're actually growing their own food, etc. All right, now logging, commercial cattle ranching are also important causes, but these are people that are just trying to feed their families, right? And tropical soils, you see all that vegetation, you'd think they'd have really good soil. In fact, it's very nutrient poor soil. So they don't get very good yields, and then they can only farm a plot of land for a certain number of years before they have to cut down more forest. They do what's called slash and burn methods. So essentially they go in, cut down all the trees, burn them. That puts some extra nutrients in the soil. They farm that for a few years until it becomes nutrient depleted, and then they go and slash and burn some more. All right? Cattle ranching is becoming a bigger thing because as people want to eat more and more meat, that's part of the demographic transition, by the way, as people become more well off, go through that demographic transition to industrialized countries, people really want to eat more meat. And so cattle ranching requires a lot more space than just growing plants, right? That's becoming an issue. And then, of course, mining, hydroelectric power, those kinds of things. But really, it's the agriculture, and in particular, subsistence agriculture in our tropical areas. Now, contrasting our tropical rainforests with our what we call tropical dry forests. So tropical dry forests are much like our arid or semi-arid grasslands in that, they don't get a lot of rainfall. Not so little rainfall that they would actually be deserts naturally, but not a lot. And something as simple as clearing trees causes desertification. In tropical dry forests, the primary reason for cutting down wood is for fuel. Okay? And the major concern in these areas is the desertification, like we talked about with our soils unit. All right? And last, but also our largest biome, is what we call the boreal forest, sometimes referred to as the taiga. Right? So it's our world's largest biome. And you can see it's these green areas here in our northern tier of Russia, Scandinavia, Canada, and Alaska. Okay? And as I mentioned before, the U.S. forests specifically are either expanding or at least steady. And that's because we're actually getting a lot of our timber now from the boreal forests, where extensive clear cutting is a big problem, especially in Russia, Siberia specifically. Okay? And the boreal forests are an important habitat for things like caribou. Several endangered species actually reside there. All right? I did want to toss in rangelands and agricultural lands before closing up this particular lecture. So rangeland makes up about a third of the United States, actually. So this is land that's not intensively managed in the way that forests would be. So these are essentially our grasslands, right? They're ideal for grazing, right? So livestock, ranching, etc. is where most of our rangelands are used for. Okay? One of the issues with rangelands is also desertification. It's this overgrazing. I know we watched that TED Talk about the importance of grazers, but that grazing needs to be managed. They essentially have to come in and graze and then move off that land almost immediately, right? Overgrazing is where we allow the animals to stay in one place for too long, right? That ends up killing the grass as opposed to helping the grass. If the grass dies, we lose that fibrous root system that allows the soil to be exposed, and then it's much more prone to erosion, leading to that nasty cancer of desertification. Okay? So these are terms we've already talked about, so I'm not going to spend much time on those. So yeah, like I said, about a third of the U.S. land area is our rangelands. 2/3 of that is privately owned, so ranchers and so on that own their own land. Again, when things are privately owned, they tend to be better taken care of. All right. There is, however, as urban areas grow, there is pressure from developers to subdivide these rangelands so we can develop them into urban sprawl, etc. So the Taylor Grazing Act and Federal Land Policy and Management Act, you guys can read up on those from the book, but that's how we manage our public rangeland. All right. Conditions of public rangeland are slowly improving. We're learning some things about proper management of our grasslands, as we saw in that TED Talk earlier. Okay. It's got a little bit long-winded. I apologize, but that's lecture 2. We got one more lecture for this unit. It will definitely be shorter than this one, and then we'll be looking at the test here. All right. I'll see you guys